Defense News is proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, we learn about a misinformation campaign that hit our publications aimed at you, the audience. We look at what's on the horizon for the defense industry as a new administration takes office and get the inside scoop on a last-minute deal to sell F-35s in the Middle East. We also check out the impacts of a string of long missions at sea for some Navy crews and get the latest on the transgender ban across the military. With the latest news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, this is Defense News Weekly. Let's get rolling. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Ben Murray, in for Andrea Scott. There's a lot happening around the military and defense world, and we begin this week with a disinformation campaign that hit close to home. One of our reporter stories about the Defense Secretary's nomination was digitally altered and posted to social media sites as a misinformation tactic. Our Defense News team has more.
Just the other day, Defense News congressional reporter Joe Gould had readers asking if one of his stories was true. They showed him screenshots of what looked like his story, with an absurd headline suggesting that President Biden's pick to leave the Pentagon was in favor of disbanding the largest U.S. military service. And spoiler alert, the headline was fake, and it took on a life of its own. With more, here's Defense News' Aaron Mehta and Joe Gould.
All right, Joe, thanks for joining me for what's one of the weirder stories I think that either of us has seen. Certainly the weirdest one that I think you've been involved in. Walk me through how you ended up being featured in a disinformation meme that's been going around the internet.
Sure. We're talking about a hoax news story that had multiple lies in it, that the new Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, was considering defunding, maybe disbanding the Army, and that he was considering relying on China for America's national defense. It had my byline on it, and it looked like a defense news story, but it was anything but. There was no story. It was a doctored image file. I got an email on a Friday afternoon asking whether this thing was true. And over the course of the weekend, I got about 6 emails like that. I watched it reproducing on Facebook dozens and dozens of times, 4chan, Twitter, Instagram, MeWe, but also Telegram. And that's an app popular with the QAnon conspiracy community. From what I learned, anybody who follows the military like we do or is in the military knows that all of that is totally laughable. You can watch Lloyd Austin's confirmation hearing and see that that's all lies. But people who are detached from reality, consuming right-wing and other conspiracy theories, are predisposed to believe that kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting about how you wrote the story up, which folks can find on defensenews.com, is how you actually reached out to a number of these people and your interactions. Some of them were, interactions where people said, "Whoa, sorry, I'm glad you pointed that out." Some of them were a little different. What was that like for you?
Well, look, there's research out there that backs up the adage that a lie spreads more quickly than the truth. And what that research also shows is that it's not bots sharing information, it's people. And, I tried to notify people on Facebook, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. And it was only when Facebook finally got around to sweeping the memes off that they started to disappear. One woman who posted it was embarrassed when I alerted her, and I told her, we're both victims. This was a meme that was crafted to deceive her by hijacking my identity and my credibility. Journalists like you and me work to deliver the truth and inform the public. Somebody was doing the opposite in my name, and that was motivating. But so were all the emails I was getting from people who either suspected it was fake and reached out for confirmation, or who were scared it was true. But as you pointed out, there are some people who are not so curious, not so intellectually honest. And when I told them who I was, that they had posted a fake meme, some of them got defensive, and they said that they were going to keep it posted because it revealed some larger truth that they believed about Joe Biden. And that kind of ignorance and persistent lying was disheartening, but it also gives you a sense of the problem.
So obviously this impacts a lot of civilians, but I mean, we've seen stuff like this spread in the military. We know there's concerns about disinformation about military members. Obviously this matters because it was dealing with the Secretary of Defense, but how is the military going to have to deal with this? Is this an issue that you think is going to keep spreading going forward?
The story's not about me. It's about, lies that were spread about Lloyd Austin, echoing the defund the police slogan used by the Black Lives Matter movement. These memes target the fault lines in our society. Race is one of them. And he's the first Black Secretary of Defense. I don't think this is the last time we'll see something like this. Another thing is that there was a Air Force general who was impersonated on Telegram, which was spreading the meme. And when I reached out to him, he said that the account didn't belong to him. So something for military members to think about is that they could potentially be impersonated online and their credibility hijacked, just like happened to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, thanks for joining us to talk about this issue and shed some light on it. I'm Aaron Mehta. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, gentlemen. And now, for defense industry headlines. There aren't a lot of nail-biters in the contract world, but here's one that slipped in at the last minute. The United Arab Emirates signed off on a deal to purchase up to 50 F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft and 18 MQ-9 Reaper drones from the United States. The deal has been estimated at some $24 billion. Here's the thing, the agreement was one of the final acts of the Trump administration, occurring just an hour before President Joe Biden was inaugurated. A source with knowledge of the situation confirmed separately to Defense News that the US and UAE officials on Wednesday signed that letter of agreement, which solidifies the terms of a foreign military sale between two nations. A problem with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle is causing a supply chain delay. The Army is designing and testing a solution to address overheating and toxic gas production in the newest version of the vehicle's turret battery, but its material release is delayed by almost a year. That's according to the Services Bradley Program Office. The problem itself was discovered during a test at Fort Hood, Texas. Kenya will be getting vehicles to combat militants. Its military has ordered 118 four-wheel drive personnel carriers from Turkish armored vehicle manufacturer Katmir. A Kenya Defense Forces spokesperson said the Ministry of Defense is finalizing the deal for the mine-resistant, ambush-protected Hazir vehicles through Turkey's Export Credit Agency. The Kenyan military will primarily deploy the Hazir vehicles for counter-terror operations against the Al-Shabaab militant group. Sources told Defense News a contract might be inked within weeks and could be worth up to $73 million. The U.S. Army organization responsible for modernizing the service's tactical network will soon have a new leader. The Army Chief of Staff announced Monday that Brigadier General Jeth Ray, the J6 of Central Command, will replace Major General Peter Gallagher as director of the Network Cross-Functional Team, a critical piece of the Army's modernization efforts. Plans for the team include increasing network resiliency, increasing broadband, and connecting the service's enterprise network in the offices with its tactical networks on the battlefield.
That's it for this week's headlines from the defense world. When we come back, we'll learn about the impacts a string of long at-sea deployments has had on sailors and ships in the Navy. And later in the show, a look at defense industry priorities as a new administration takes over. Welcome back. In your military news this week, we begin in the Navy, where a combination of high operations tempo and COVID-related measures created major impacts on parts of the fleet. A combination of long at-sea missions and quick turnarounds created tough conditions for sailors and put long miles on some ships. Navy Times' Jeff Zazulowicz has more on the story.
2020 was a hard year for everybody, of course, but within the U.S. Navy, it was arguably even harder. Navy leadership struggled to keep ships at sea COVID-free after the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt suffered a mass infection in the spring of 2020. The COVID mitigation measures for the U.S. surface fleet in particular involved no more port calls or stepping on dry land, sometimes for record-breaking stints at a time. This meant several ships in 2020 broke the record for consecutive days at sea. The U.S. warship Stout spent 215 consecutive days at sea, which is a modern record. It limped back into port in Norfolk, rusted out, and with a crew that was obviously ready to hit dry land. So basically, you had a couple things going on in 2020 with the Navy. You had COVID, which meant sailors have to isolate before they get on the ship for a few weeks, taking them away from their families right before a deployment. Then they get on and they basically can't leave the ship for the entire deployment because of the risk of bringing COVID back. And then at the same time, the Navy and the Pentagon didn't slow down the pace of operations in 2020 due to the pandemic. Somewhere in the Pentagon decision-making rings, there was a thought that you still needed to push ships and aircraft carriers out to the Middle East and to the Pacific and to other areas to showcase, American military presence. And so that's kind of what 2020 had wrought for the surface fleet and appears to be continuing into 2021. Before a carrier strike group goes on into deployment, normally they do something called a Comp 2X, which is like a kind of pre-deployment exercise. In pre-COVID times, you'd go do a Comp 2X and then be able to go back to your family, for a few weeks before the official deployment started. But the Navy has opted to keep sailors aboard the ship between the Comp 2X and the actual start of the deployment. And then that, therefore leads to, 9-month deployments as opposed to 7 or 8-month deployments. Now, once they're at sea, a critical kind of pressure release valve for crews is port calls. If you're steaming through Asia, you might stop in Vietnam or Japan, or just get off the ship. But in the days of COVID, for now, at least as we record this, that's not the case, and those port calls aren't happening. So, a sailor is seeing their rack, their workspace, and the endless horizon of the seas around them for months on end. Based on our reporting, these long deployments in the time of COVID are really taking a toll on sailors and their families. To be frank, a lot of sailors and families are feeling pretty screwed by Big Navy at this point. These deployments, the double pumps, especially of the Theodore Roosevelt and the Eisenhower, are leading a lot of sailors and families to question their future in the Navy. Several of them have told us that they plan to do 20 years. They plan to make a career in the sea service, but 2020 has just changed that calculus for them.
Our experience is that sailors will do amazing things and they'll try very hard to accomplish their missions. They're by and large great humans, do their very best. But it's a lot to ask of somebody to be underway continuously for 211, 212 days without a port visit. And it's a lot to expect of them to be sequestered prior to getting underway and sequestered after coming back. And it would not be at all surprising to find that there's less willingness to stay in the Navy after these types of deployments take place.
It remains to be seen, how these deployments and this operations pace and the COVID mitigations will affect either recruitment or retention. But anecdotally, we're being told by spouses and sailors that, this is a breaking point. An aircraft carrier is a marvel of human engineering, but it's a zillion parts that need maintenance and care. And when you push any ship back out to sea without adequate maintenance time, it's going to take time off the ship's life. But analysts tell us that that's even more pronounced with a vessel like an aircraft carrier. So there's a lot of fear among those who have served before and now kind of make their living analyzing the Navy that double pumping the Ike and the TR is ultimately going to send those ships to an early grave, so to speak. It's going to take years off of their service life potentially, and it just erodes readiness in general. And the fear is that if you push these carriers back out to sea only a few months after they came home, perhaps they might not be available, God forbid, should an actual war break out where they're needed.
In terms of the overall impact on the ship, it comes back to this spiral of a ship comes back from a long deployment with a lot of problems that have to be fixed. It goes into a maintenance availability, And that takes time, and frequently, more often than not, it's the case that the availabilities go longer because so much has to be fixed. And as a result, the schedule for the next ship is affected, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It's very hard for the Navy, the surface Navy in this case, but from aircraft carriers or submarines or anything else to get out of that. And so not only is it potentially affecting the morale and well-being of the crews, it is definitely potentially having an impact on the ability to get ready for some major contingency.
Thanks, Jeff. For more on that story, visit NavyTimes.com. And in other military news this week, President Joe Biden is set to remove a ban on transgender people joining the military. The restriction, put in place by former President Donald Trump in 2017, reversed the policy from the Obama administration, allowing transgender troops to enlist and serve openly in the military. And in one of his first actions as newly confirmed Secretary of Defense, retired General Lloyd Austin III ordered an immediate review of measures to reduce sexual harassment and assault in the ranks. Austin gave senior leaders until February 5th to provide a summary of current measures with an eye toward aggressive reform and prevention. And finally, the Army is set to buy a large number of next-generation sniper rifles in coming years, according to a release from the Army Contracting Command. The release confirms that nearly 3,000 troops will receive the multi-role adaptive rifle made by Barrett over the next 5 years. The rifle had previously been approved for special operations units. When we come back, we'll hear some tax tips for military families by personal finance expert Jeanette Mack. And later, a look at the state of play in the defense industry as the Biden administration takes over. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers some tips for military families as the 2021 tax season arrives.
The new year brings the promise of new beginnings and the joy of filing your taxes. Hold on, there can be some joys in that too. If you're an active duty service member or part of a military family, there are some tax benefits that can help put some extra cash back in your pocket. If you've PCS'd in the last year, you can deduct your moving expenses. Moving isn't cheap and not all of those costs are reimbursed. And since the IRS allows you to write off reasonable costs associated with relocation and moving, you absolutely should. Also, research the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act. It allows military spouses to only pay income tax for their official state of residence rather than where you're currently living. And it can mean a pretty good tax break if your home state tax rate is lower than where you're currently stationed. And don't forget the cost of any uniforms you've bought, gotten cleaned, or had to get fitted. That can be deducted too. Tracking these expenses all year long can make things easier on you at tax time. It's a small thing to do to get big returns.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next time. To get more of our coverage, be sure to visit our websites at Army, Navy, Air Force, and MarineCorpsTimes.com and DefenseNews.com. For our curated top stories in your inbox every day, subscribe to our Early Bird Brief. And to keep up to date with all our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages. Also, it's that time of year again. Time to nominate your fellow soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine for our annual Service Member of the Year. Categories are also open for Coast Guardsman and Veteran of the Year. To nominate your fellow service member, head to servicemembersoftheyear.org/nominate. And when we come back, we'll learn about the latest in the defense industry from our defense news team of journalists. Welcome back. As a new administration and Congress take over in the Capitol with new priorities and agendas, the field of play evolves for the defense industry. For a look ahead at what's on the horizon for the defense world, defense news journalists lay out what they see as the biggest coming stories.
Welcome to this week's Reporters Roundtable. I'm Aaron Mehta. With the Biden administration officially in office, we decided to have three of our defense news colleagues, Jen Judson, David Larder, and Valerie Sinha, join us to discuss how the Biden administration might differ from the Trump administration and how it deals with the three military services. We're going to start with Jen. Jen, you cover the Army very closely. What are you looking for out of the Biden administration going forward?
Well, I think one of the things to watch out for with the Biden administration is I think we're already looking at a lower top line budget for the Army. The other services have a lot of priorities as well. So I think that there is a concern that the Army budget will go down. If it were to stay flat, the Army would still lose about $13 billion in buying power from FY19 to FY22. So the Army is obviously going to have to maybe look at their modernization priorities and cut from those priorities or scale back some of their current plans. So we could definitely see some major changes in terms of what those modernization priorities may be if the budget is slashed. I think the other thing to look out for is in the past administration, a 4-star command was set up to handle modernization priorities called Army Futures Command. I think it'll be interesting to see what Biden wants to do with that. Could it become a 3-star or a 2-star command? Could it be downscaled? Could it be moved from Austin, Texas? That's been a little bit controversial, putting the headquarters there. So I think it'll be interesting to see what they do there, particularly in terms of giving power to the acquisition community and the modernization community, and who's going to be responsible for what, because that's been a little bit difficult to organize.
All right. David, same question for the Navy, which is a service that's kind of going through a bit of a transition right now, right?
Yes, I think what's going to happen in the first year of the Biden administration will be the Navy's going to have to look at priorities in terms of where do they want to spend their money. The capacity of the fleet to handle its current workload is, I think, by all measures insufficient. The carriers are right now going out for, these 2 deployments in 1 deployment cycle. We call them double pump deployments. So in one 36-month readiness cycle, the aircraft carriers are going out twice, which is an unsustainable pace of operations, which speaks to a certain lack of capacity, just not enough peanut butter to scrape across the bread. Just not enough ships to do the workload that they have. During the last year, Mark Esper and the Pentagon and the Navy and OSD CAPE, which is his in-house think tank, took a look at some ways to try and creatively solve this problem. It didn't quite make it all the way up to the White House. The White House had their own ideas, and I think everyone kind of got to the end of the line of a whole year of looking at how are we going to fix the Navy's capacity, and we kind of ended up where we started. The ideas that OSD CAPE were putting forward had a lot to do with unmanned surface vessels, unmanned underwater vessels as a means of boosting the Navy's capacity. But it remains to be seen if that's the way the Navy's going to go forward. So I think the Biden administration in the first year is going to have to wrestle with all the same questions that we wrestled with all last year. How are you going to fix this capacity problem?
So a little bit of the more things change, the more things stay the same. All right, Val, I wanted to go to you last, partly because maybe the biggest legacy of the Trump administration on the military is going to be the creation of the Space Force, the new branch of the military. That falls under your beat as the Air Force reporter. How do you think the Biden team is going to tackle that? And then what else might they be looking at?
Well, I think there's been a lot of speculation about whether the Biden administration seeks to disestablish the Space Force. Every expert that I've talked to says that that's not going to happen, that it's far more likely that the Biden administration just continues on with the work that the Space Force has already been doing. I think one thing that could come into question, though, is the location of U.S. Space Command. Right before Trump left office, it was decided that that new headquarters would be placed in Alabama. That was a very controversial decision for a lot of reasons, and one that the Biden administration could seek to open up. Another thing that I think might be big over the next year is a discussion about fighter mix. President Trump involved himself very, very directly in questioning, how many F-35s should we buy? Should we buy more Super Hornets? Should there be fly-offs between this plane and that plane? And I don't think we'll see that so out in the open in the Biden administration, but I do think that the Air Force will continue to have those discussions of what's the proper mix between F-15s, F-35s, and maybe even F-16s.
Sounds right. Well, thank you all for joining me. Of course, as these stories develop or don't develop, we'll be tracking it all on defensenews.com. Again, thanks everyone for joining me. I'm Aaron Mehta.
That's all we have time for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.